Have you ever wondered whether the problems in the world today would exist if we had deeper connection to ourselves, others, and the environment, and acted from that place?
Welcome to the Conscious Action Podcast with your hosts Brian Berneman and Kayla Greenville, who believe that connection is the key to taking conscious action as individuals and creating a better world.
We are here to raise awareness and inspire meaningful action by sharing stories, knowledge, and conversations with thought leaders and change makers.
From sustainability to well-being and everything related to conscious living, our mission is to empower you to be the change that you want to see in the world.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Conscious Action Podcast. I am Brian Berneman, your host, and I have the pleasure for this episode to be joined by Richie Hardcore, all the way here from Auckland as well, but of course, each person at home. And thank you so much, Richie, for taking the time to be here with us and to share what I'm sure will be a wonderful and juicy conversation. And to start, I would love for you to share with everyone listening, who is Richie?
I'm still trying to find the answer myself, I suppose, sometimes. But the things that I do, and I guess like my work, like professionally, has all sort of stemmed out of a desire to understand myself. And the work that I do is focused on working around men and masculinity. At the moment, I started out doing public speaking and education work and advocacy work around stopping family violence and domestic violence, maybe, I guess, like for the better part of the last 10 years. And that's evolved upwards to looking at some of those root drivers of violence. And that leads to me to where I am now, which is talking about masculinity and the cultural expectations of boys and men to fit into particular boxes of behavior. And those boxes of behavior can lead to a whole lot of psychological distress and a whole bunch of negative outcomes. So I talk about that in schools and in businesses and anywhere that really has an interest in having those conversations. I run a little workshop series with the support of the Ministry of Social Development, focused on getting like the martial arts community involved in these sort of talks as well, because outside of this space, I've been a martial artist for 28 years. I started fighting in like freestyle taekwondo when I was a teenager, when I was 13, and then I moved into fighting in Muay Thai, and I was, successful here in the bygone days before the sport is what it is now, and retired from fighting and moved into coaching. So I sort of bring those things together. I guess being in the gym all the time, training fighters, training a lot of predominantly men and boys, keeps me quite grounded in a stereotypically masculine environment, I suppose. And that informs my work when it comes to working with, schools and other organizations, because I think activists and educators and academics can get quite siloed and forget about the reality of things, and often speak in ways that just don't resonate with people who aren't having these conversations all the time. And I've gone back to university, and I'm slowly working through my master's degree, looking in all this stuff. And every time I open like a paper or an academic body work I'm trying to cite from, I'm like, oh my God, no wonder people don't get engaged when a lot of activists try and use hyper academic language to explain these concepts. So yeah, that kind of is the by and large of it. I do mental health sort of advocacy work. It's an emergent. I don't know what's a mental health advocate. But I talk about mental health. I talk about the fact that I used to want to kill myself, and I had a lot of depression, and I didn't even know that I was depressed when I was going through that journey. From about 2011 till about 2016, 17, I had really hugely fluctuating mental health, and within all of that, I was working in alcohol and drug harm reduction for the Ministry of Health / Auckland Council. I did a radio show with a guy called Mike King about mental health. He'd get me to fill in for him sometimes, and we would have these big discussions about mental illness, and it's kind of led to this kind of advocacy and education space where I underpin my personal experiences with research, because I don't want to just be sharing my opinions on things. I like to ensure that it's grounded in some sort of empirical evidence.
Yeah, thank you for that. Like, I mean, there's so much in there, and it's so wonderful that some of us are fortunate enough to be able to do this type of important work, and it's what we want to do as well with our time. It's so wonderful when we're able to make a living, however that looks, and doing it with purpose and doing it with something that has a meaning for us and for our communities. And I think that what you do is so important, and it's really interesting. So, and I would love for you to share a little bit about this, is that when I actually met you, I had a completely different idea of who you were, based on, like, just, I have only seen some things online about you fighting Muay Thai, like, and that, and I was like, oh, this dude is actually really different than what I picture in my head. and I've heard you talking a couple of times, and I think that it's really, really wonderful to be able to do this work that you do on as well. What does it mean to be a man, and what are the expectations, and what are all of the different things that a society, especially here in New Zealand, each society is quite different and each culture has its differences, but what we perceive and what is reality and how we experience all of that, I think that it's really, really interesting from that standpoint. And I would love for you to share and to explore a little bit more on what are these expectations or these judgments that we have, and how that actually messes with where we're going as men, as society, and how that plays a role in it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we all sort of grow up absorbing the concepts around us, right? Like, for me and for a lot of my generation, and this continues today, we're expected as boys to do things like take risks, use violence as a problem-solving tool. We have a valorization of physical activity, of making lots of money, of scoring lots of girls. We have a general consensus that to be soft and gentle and anything stereotypically feminine is a negative thing. And that flows on to a degree of homophobia. And these things are acculturated into us quite even unintentionally, I think. I'm raising my son, well, my stepson, and he comes home and he's like, oh, so-and-so said this boy was gay, because it's like just a given that associations for 7-year-old boys that gay is negative. But when you stop and explain what that looks like, people tend to understand it if you can give them a reframing of those ideas, right? And that's essentially sort of the work that I do. It's not to say there aren't differences between men and women. There are. Like, across all averages, there is, humans are a dimorphic species. There are two sexes, and biologically, evolutionary biologists will explain that we do have some degree of difference in our behaviors and our interests, right? But the socialization that we can either steer us away from things or double down on things is the sort of space where we find the hope in, right? Across the sexes, boys and men do tend to be a bit more aggressive and have a higher predisposition towards an interest in like mechanical things or violence. But that doesn't mean to say that we have to be truck drivers who like fighting, right? Like, if we only give young boys toys that encourage violence and disdainful towards emotional vulnerability, or we tease the kids who are into poetry and art and music, and we only valorize the kids who are into like rugby and boxing, then that's where we get all the problems that we have, because we're always trying to push. I would talk about, we have the whole same process for girls and women too, right? And we have these cultural ideas of femininity that girls and women are expected to fit into, and when they don't, we see all the sorts of associated problems. It's like eating disorders and self-harming behavior, and it's the same with boys and men. We're always trying to push these like sort of square pegs through round holes, right? Because none of us can actually really live up to this ideal of having like a six-pack all the time and earning a six-figure salary and being able to perform all these athletic pursuits effortlessly and have like a harem of beautiful women just dying to do our laundry, right? Like those are all stupid ideas that are presented to us as how we should be, and they're presented to us through either social media. If you look at music videos, if you think about the jokes and stories that we hear in the schoolyard or in the sports club, things our parents might say to us or our relatives might say to us, and we kind of culturally enforce these stereotypes. I don't know about you, but I was not always like a jock covered in tattoos who is good at fighting. Like I was a pretty sensitive kid who liked reading books, and I kind of stuck to myself. Although I was like, I guess, extrovert in some ways, I had a lot of dysfunction in my childhood, which made me have very low self-esteem. And so I didn't like rush to play sport or any of these sorts of things. I liked playing Dungeons and Dragons and like role-playing games and shit. I used to like paint figurines and stuff, right? Like I would stay at home and read books and like watch romantic comedies by myself and like dream of holding someone's hand. And it wasn't until I got into stereotypically masculine pursuits that I got like social acceptance and social approval. And that's quite interesting to look back on. Because I didn't do it consciously, but I've told this story before, but there were, I guess, two key moments when I realized that like physical strength and fighting were like a social pass. And one was getting in a fight at school with some boys who came to beat up my friend. And then everyone at school stopped calling me a clown and a homo. And I was like the man. And I got cool, I got cool. And so I cut my hair's naturally very curly, and I used to dye it pink, and I used to have a nose ring, and I used to be like real alternative and emo and into grunge and like the opposite of jock culture, right? I really wanted to position myself outside of that, but I rebuilt my identity into this more masculinely approved identity. So I started wearing like basketball singlets and baggy jeans and like, got my first tattoo when I was 18, and this wasn't conscious. It was just like everyone liked me better. Dudes liked me better. Women liked me better. Like, and in some parts, I liked myself better. And that's not an inherently bad thing. Like, it was good that I started having some self-confidence that came with sport and social recognition. But it was also kind of veiling the more sensitive parts of myself. Right, like I had to shut off bits of myself from public life, and you posture and you brag about, I don't know, the street fight that you got into at the party, or the girl who asked you out, and all these sorts of negative parts that come with the social expectation to masculinity. And so that was one way of my pathway into manhood, I guess. And I had quite a dysfunctional childhood, and I remember once beating up my dad, because my dad was an abusive alcoholic at times. And I love my dad. My dad is part of this journey. My dad is someone who had his own traumas as a child in an era where we didn't talk about masculinity or mental health, right? And so with a whole family history of mental illness that I've been uncovering to figure myself out, he was born into, he just poured alcohol onto these sorts of stereotypical tropes that we're talking about. And, you know, my grandfather was an alcoholic. My great-grandfather was an alcoholic who came back from World War I traumatized. And so my dad had his struggles, right? And his struggles meant that he didn't know how to express himself or heal or deal with his pain. Only could try and escape it with like ridiculous amounts of alcohol. And that meant sometimes he was a dick. And this one time, like, I punched him out pretty good. And that was a strangely, what was that? That was kind of like this strangely masculine taking of my power. Do you know what I mean? In a very unhealthy, dysfunctional way. But I suddenly felt like, oh, there's some worth in my physicality and my strength and my ability to hurt people, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, many people come to that and never leave it. And I've been fortunate that I've had role models and positive interventions and education and that have steered me away from that. Because my other path that I could have been on is like many of my friends into like gangs and violence and drug addiction, you know, or self-destructive behaviors. You know, like a lot of my friends, people I love very dearly, are still stuck in that place, or they're doing crime, or they're in jail, or have been to jail. Some have killed themselves. Not all of them, but a good number of people I know might be high functioning addicts, right? They might be musicians, and they live in worlds that normalize unhealthy coping mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just grateful to the good people in my life who've steered me away from that. Because like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with how one's brain develops. When you grow up with some trauma, your brain responds really differently to different situations, right? Like my brain, when it comes to like a fight or flight situation, is like, boom, straight to the amygdala. I'm like, yes, like I feel alive. Like, oh, there's a threat. Like I do well in the chaotic space. And if I feel challenged by men in particular, but also like adverse things, anger and feeling my body get defensive and bristle and preparing for conflict is kind of where I go to, right? But I've been socialized away from that. So as much as I might feel like beating someone up when they're a dickhead, I don't, right? Right? Whereas other people don't. And this is an interesting thing I think we need to talk about when we're talking about like crime and punishment and restorative justice. Who makes up our prisons? It's people from economically marginalized neighborhoods who have long histories of trauma, often with undiagnosed mental health issues and substance abuse. And it's not a rational decision to beat someone up when they cut you off in traffic. It's wrong, but they're not like making it like in a calculated way. It's like their brain goes straight into this very primal space and they act out on that.
Yeah.
And that does, again, it doesn't excuse the violence that they might perpetrate, but it does explain it. And if we want to stop violence, we need to have that conversation. How do you help people have really long-winded approaches to dealing with the trauma that they experienced as kids? How do you help create a society where we don't get people to double down on these shitty stereotypes about violence? Because if you associate with people who have a belief that violence is a good problem-solving tool, and you are neurologically predisposed to respond from an emotive space and thus act out violently, chances are you can be violent, right? Right? So I've got like one subset of friends who, when someone is a dick or disrespectful, they're like, fuck, just give them a hiding, right? Like that's like a common New Zealand thing. Did you give them a hiding? I don't know if I don't know how long you've been around here, or right? Like, but you've heard the phrase, did he get a hiding? Give him a hiding, right? And then another subset of friends who are like, well, violence isn't the answer. And we need a bit more of the latter and less of the former, right?
Yeah.
It's not demonizing the human experience of anger. Like, we're all meant to be angry at some stage in our lives. Like, anger is a normal human response, and it can actually be really protective. And for me, anger's driven me to a degree of surpassing where I came from, right? Like, anger made me want to go to university, right? Anger made me want to be sober. Anger made me want to be a better version of myself and be more than my dad was. But it's not everything, because it eventually got to the point where it was like burning me out. And that's where I've sort of come to with like activism and advocacy work. Like, I find so much of it is just this blind fury dressed up in hyper academic jargon, and it's destructive, not constructive. And that doesn't work, man, because no one likes being made to feel bad or told that they're a piece of shit. You can only coerce people's behavior change for so long until eventually it stops working and they might push back. So
yeah,
I'm glad that I've come to sort of terms with that, because you know, like, as an academic and an activist, I guess it doesn't work. It's not like fit for purpose as a tool. And in my personal life, anger's kept big walls between me and people I really love, and it's made me be a dick, you know. Not physically, I've never like beaten up people or been abusive, but I've been judgmental, and I've been closed-minded and narrow-minded, and I guess myopic, because my anger made me think that this is the only way to be and this is the only way to do something, and if you didn't do that, you're a fucking lazy piece of shit, or you're weak. You know, when we think about masculinity, it's about strength, right? And I can tough my way through like all my problems if I just went running more and did more press-ups, more pull-ups, and like one more kickboxing fights. And all my pain would go away, right? And anyone who just like moaned and like was poor me was fucking weak. And it's not that simple nor that black and white.
And there's, you know, from everything that you're sharing, there's so much in that, because I think that there's some things that are really important. This is, of course, based on how we are conditioned and how we as society have created these different stereotypes, and how we are being drawn to have this normal life, whatever that means. And as you said, like, that's a little bit of bullshit. Like, that doesn't exist really. And what that is doing as well is that is preventing people from dealing with what is actually happening from both a mental health perspective and an emotional perspective. I've been blessed enough to live in a really loving house without much trauma or without any abuse or any kind of issues like that a lot of people have. And I was really fortunate to be introduced to meditation and mindfulness and Buddhist perspectives, so that I could understand what is happening when something happens to me, and how do I choose to respond instead of how do I react, which my reactions were based on all of the things that I have learned, as you said. Like, yes, like, of course, some people, you know, as you were saying, we have either that fight or flight or freeze response, and depending on where you are with that, that's what we're going to do in terms of reaction. But I was lucky enough to be able to understand, okay, how do I process this, and then what is actually going to serve any given situation in terms of, does this need to be escalated, or does this need to be okay, let's take some time, let's figure this out, let's talk about it. But if I don't have the tools to work internally, then that makes it hard. And as you're saying, like, as a society, we've been conditioned in a lot of ways, both men and women, in different roles. And when we are wanting to fit in and to belong, which is something that we all want. We want that feeling of belonging. And what you were sharing when you were younger, and you get that feedback from people, ooh, if I do this, actually people like me, then I want to do more of that, even if that's not what you want to do all of the time. And I think that the lack of education in this plays a huge role. And one of the things that I would love for you to explore a little bit more in depth is the place not only of the lack of education in that, but also of trauma. Because as you were saying, traumatized people then usually inflict that trauma because it isn't processed, as you were saying with your family, like alcohol, or a lot of different things, but that is just one way of coping with things. But most of the people, and I work sometimes within the space of the healing perspective of that, is that we haven't dealt with our traumas, our ancestral trauma, and all of that, which means that somehow we are still carrying that on. And until the moment that we look at that and face it and heal it, then we cannot move past it.
Yeah, I love that. I think about that a lot, and I'm still learning about like epigenetics, right? Like that cultural transmission and what's the word I'm looking for? That cultural transmission, historical transmission, and the how our environments can activate or not activate different parts of ourselves, right? And I'm not an expert in this, so take everything as like a work in progress, please, dear listener, dear Brian. But I'll talk from my own perspective, right? So, my dad's an alcoholic, and I grew up with a lot of dysfunction, and the cops come into my house. And I was just talking to Claire, my partner, about this last night, actually, because we're watching this show called Shameless, and it's really, really triggering for me. And I find myself crying a lot during it. And it's a lighthearted show, but it's about this very, very dysfunctional family where the father is a chronic alcoholic. And the actor gets it so right, right? Like so right. And I'm like, fuck this. Like, this is gnarly, right? And anyway, my father's an alcoholic. My grandfather apparently was an alcoholic. He died when I was maybe 12, so I didn't really know. My great-grandfather came back from the war, traumatized from the war, and left my great-grandmother to raise my grandfather by herself in an era where they didn't have the social supports or the social acceptance of single mothers. So my father's side of the family. On my father's mother's side of the family, I just learned last year that my great-grandmother on that side of the family was put into Kingsey, which is like a mental institute, like some one flew over the cuckoo's nest shit, right? And I don't know much about it, and I'd really like to learn more about it because I find it there's some healing for me and some peacemaking and sense making and understanding what happened in my heritage. Yeah. So either way, there's a long fucking history of like dysfunction, right? Doesn't mean I'm genetically going to be dysfunctional, but how those traumas are passed down through behavior is definitely going to have some way in how I turned out, right? So I thought I had all my shit figured out, but I didn't, because when I was 31, I had an affair and my marriage ended really badly. And I still carry 10 years later all this guilt and shame and pain around that. And I'm working through all of that. But when I look back at how that happened, I'm just recreating my family history, right? So we gravitate to what's comfortable and what's normal to us, yeah? And what's comfortable and what's normal to me is fucking chaos and drama and crazy people, because that's what I grew up with. And I was talking to Claire last night about this. When I was like a teenager and I thought about the women that were romantically or sexually attracted to me, looking back, oh my God, this one had a heroin problem, or this one was sexually abused as a child. And I had these conversations with adults with these women. Or, I was talking to like one of my old best friends who I had like some sexual intimacy with when I was as a teenager. Her dad was an alcoholic. When I think about basically all of my ex-partners had a trauma which matched my trauma, right? And so I fall into this role of trying to be a rescuer, if you think about it in like a codependency. It's like, okay, right, how do I save you from yourself? How do I, but at the same time, enable your shitty behaviors, which are damaging to all of us? And it comes from like a really deeply loving place, but it also comes from a really deeply wounded place, because any relationship should be two 50% equations, each living their own full journey and navigating the space in between. But often our relationships would become unbalanced or one-sided and unhealthy in that regard, right? And it just made for just unhealthy dynamics within relationships.
Yeah.
No, and I was in this long-term relationship through my 20s, which became a marriage, and I exited that not because I didn't love my ex-wife. I still love my ex-wife, even though we haven't talked in years, but because I didn't know how to navigate things when they became a bit peaceful. Like peace was uncomfortable, I guess. Looking back, I didn't know what my role was anymore, that I wasn't rescuing her anymore. And so what I did, and I've come to learn that you don't know what you don't know till you know it, right? Like, forgive yourself for all the things that you weren't aware of. But I ended up leaving her for a woman who had a lot of personality disorder issues and like historically was a heroin user. And I'm like, well, a new project. Like, I'll fucking go over here and like make things exciting and interesting here. Do you think that worked out? Like, I ended up hurting the person profoundly that I love the most, and blew my own life up. Like, went from like having a home and being married, and I just graduated with an honors degree at university, to fucking nearly 10 years of like feeling like killing myself and like being an absolute mess. And then I would have, as I put myself back together, all these different insights and revelations. And I had some really nice relationships with some really, really, really wonderful women. But I had a couple of really bad ones too, with women that I gravitated towards, who again recreated those dynamics, right? Who had really bad mental health, who would lie and cheat and carry on and abuse substances behind my back. And like, it made me fucking all the crazier, right? And it took me to get to like a real rock bottom, where I just didn't want to be here anymore, man. Like, I really felt like, fuck, I'm done with this. Like, the pain is what stands out in one's memory more. It's very strange, right? Like, there's not really like scars for happiness, I quote a lot. It's all the painful things that stick out. And all I could think of was all the painful shit that I'd been through, right? And while I never tried to kill myself, like, I really thought about killing myself, a lot. I didn't sleep. I was fucking just this depressed sack of shit for a long time, missing heaps of work, all this sort of stuff. I hit this rock bottom, and it was like the best thing that ever happened to me, really, in lots of ways, right? Like, losing all hope is kind of like the sense of freedom. Like, I got to fucking do something. And this is like, I'm trying to give you like a linear narrative for storytelling purposes, but there's lots of ebbs and flows that went with this, lots of moments of clarity and insight and learning. And anyway, I went back to a psychologist and who I'd been working with for some time, trying to process my divorce. And she really helped get me better. I stopped taking the Xanax that they've had fucking given me, and enrolled in my first full marathon, and went back to the life of being a fighter. Like, being a professional fighter gives you a very structured life. And while I'd retired from fighting in 2013, when I was very depressed, I suppose, well, in ebbs and flows of depression, I kind of drifted away from the lifestyle, right? Like, just ate whatever, didn't train as much, like, but I started just living the life again, man. And that's what I've continued to do, because it's the structure and the physiological rewards and the psychological pharmaceutical rewards that come with exercise, the community, the sense of belonging, the sense of purpose. All these things, evidence has now shown me, as well as my lived experience, are fucking good for your mental fitness and well-being. So, the last 5 years in particular have been this real intentional journey of continuing to build a life that stays well, right?
Yeah.
Because I had to put myself back together. And I guess I'm grateful for the fact that as a teenager and a man in my 20s, I built a good scaffolding around myself, which was essentially based in sport, but also the community that came from the music culture that I grew up in, which was like the hardcore straight edge punk rock scene, right? And so those two things were, in hindsight, a subconscious protective factor. So when my life I won't say it fell to bits, because that takes agency out of it. When I destroyed my life, when I threw dynamite into my life to make it chaotic and insane, I could claw myself back up on the good scaffolding that I'd had the wherewithal to somehow magically build around myself as a kid, right? My childhood didn't have, my childhood wasn't all bad. Like, I wasn't tortured or raped or sexually abused, because I work with kids like that now in the gym, right? The stories I hear in my day-to-day work are fucking heartbreaking. And my childhood wasn't like that. But it's not healthy what I grew up with. And no one should have to visit their parents in rehab or see the police take them away or hit them, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't have that. And I built the structure that we know to be good for developmental purposes, sort of subconsciously. Like, I went to martial arts, and as a 13-year-old boy, I had walk an hour each way to go do like press-ups on my knuckles on a fucking hardwood floor and get like blood noses and like kicked in teeth and all this shit. And I'm fucking so grateful for that, right? Like, it was, if I hadn't done that, then the other alternative is what my friends got into, which was like drugs and booze and like fighting outside of the gym, right? Like, in our pathway to manhood, we would go out to parties and shit and like want to talk to girls, but be too insecure. And there'd be some other dudes who are equally as insecure, and they'd turn up and they'd be like, fuck, what are you looking at? And you'd be like, fuck, what are you looking at? And then it's just like, you just have a fist fight, man. And like, it was wild when I think about it. Like, you come from Colombia, right? And
Argentina.
Argentina, sorry.
Yeah,
Argentina.
that's all right.
But like, I apologize. But like, when I think about violence within like the Latin American context and New Zealand context, these are different things, right? Like Argentina had like a military revolution and a dictatorship and like a long history of political violence, right? It's not like that, but it was still violence. And so that's how I could have turned out, I think, right? And I carry that with me today, not because I'm stuck in a space, but because it's a trauma-informed approach to the work that I do. If I can't go into a prison, or if I can't go into a school, or I can't go into talk to the police or the military or whatever and say, look, I know what it's like to like get in a fight or want to fucking kick someone's teeth in, like, they're not necessarily going to listen to me. If I'm just like, have you read the fucking handbook for like masculinities? Like, this is what Kimmel and Connell say about like manhood, right? People are like, whatever, motherfucker. Like, I don't give a fuck, right? If you can meet people where they are, you're far better placed to help them on their journey, if that's your desire, right?
Yes, definitely. Like, I don't have that. Like, I've as I had a very different life experience, and a lot of times, and I know this, there's people that, of course, won't relate to me because I haven't experienced that. And I can share, a different perspective. I can share different things, but there's so much of that power of being able to really to get role models, or people that, more than a role model, someone that can give you some frameworks or some understandings based on, I've had some shitty experiences. I've had these challenges, and I'm dealing with them. And I think that one of the things that you mentioned there that was really, really important is taking responsibility and agency for the part that we play in all of that. Because yes, we have all of that trauma. Yes, we have all of those things that happen to us. And that, of course, is going to inform how we behave later on. At the same time, we can actually take that on or not. And the more that we have frameworks and education and behaviors that are going to be helpful for us to be able to deal with things, it makes things easier. That doesn't mean that life is going to be easy. But one of the things for me that I know based on my upbringing, based on the work that I do, is all of the time trying to, and you said this, that hitting rock bottom, I'm trying to get people not to get to that point.
Yeah.
Because yes, it is a wonderful place to be on once you're on the other side. But a lot of people actually don't make it on the other side. A lot of people, that rock bottom it's out. That's it. So trying to educate people, it's so important, and having conversations like this and I'm really grateful that you're open to sharing that you had depression, that you had suicidal thoughts, that you had all of these challenges in your life, because then this also gives people permission to talk about their own stuff and to be able to, once we acknowledge, there's stuff there, what can I do to actually deal with this?
Yeah, I think that's where I think we're at this great point where we're doing that. And this is maybe a bit nuanced, but I think we also have to be important not to romanticize it, because increasingly I see younger people put all their suffering into their bio on Instagram, and it becomes like their personal brand. And if all you are is if you build your identity around your mental health issues or your suffering and your struggle, there's no impetus to heal and change and move forwards to that place of a life that's more stable. And I too have to be mindful of the stories I tell myself, that even I'm 41 now, I'm not who I was. Like it's part of who I am, but it's not who I was. Like my life's fucking great. I have a fucking beautiful partner and a beautiful stepson, and like I'm respected in my field, and like fuck, life's cool, man. like do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I have like my own internal narratives which will tell me that life's not cool sometimes, but that's not an objective truth. Like by and large, my life's fucking great, and I'm really fucking fortunate and privileged and lucky. And that doesn't mean that I haven't worked really fucking hard to be where I am, because I have.
Yeah.
But I have to keep in mind that shit's pretty good. Yeah, And I feel that a lot of people want the valorization and affirmation which comes from being a victim, and that might rub some people the wrong way. But it's an observation that I'm starting to see shared more and more among other social commentators or social observers, or people that I talk with. When you're so married to your wounding, that's kind of like the basis of your personal brand, that's a bad thing, because it encourages all the other people looking at you to fucking stay wounded, and not to like do the hard graft to get better. And unfortunately now you can build a huge brand on your dysfunctionality. You can monetize it, right? You can monetize it, and that's a real worry. I was talking to someone in the comment section recently about this, that when it comes to like outrage culture and cancel culture and all things which I think are reflective of sick psyche or dysfunctionality culturally and personally, like the algorithm monetizes that. Huge corporations, this might sound a bit meta. Some people are like, what, dude? But like huge corporations make billions and billions of dollars by keeping us glued to our screens. And what keeps us glued to our screens is the emotional response we get to what we're soaking up. And what the emotional response has been that provokes our addiction to social media, or anti-social media, as I like to preface it, is outrage. And people who are searching for a sense of self and who do have a painful internal dissonance or have really terrible histories of trauma or mental illness or personality disorders or any number of things, or just a bit dissatisfied and fucking lonely, they can not only build an identity based on all of those things online and then develop a very curated version of themselves online, because no matter how honest you are online, and I try to be very honest, it's still online. It's not all of me, right? It's not like every aspect of my personality, good and bad. And that's what I think increasingly more and more people are doing. I think it's going to change eventually, but for the time being, it's really detrimental. It's detrimental to us as individuals, and it's hugely detrimental to us societally. Because there shouldn't be a primacy towards the negative. There should be a primacy towards optimism and hope and joy and offering solutions, and not just like pointing out problems. Like, awareness raising is great, education is great. Yeah, the world has got all these issues, but what are you going to do about them? You know?
And that is one of the biggest things for me that I do with my work, not only through conscious action, but when I'm working, one-on-one with people. There's so many different things in there that it's like, yes, this happened. Yes, this is what we are. How are you going to relate to that? Because as you're saying, lots of us, what end up doing is we start to identify ourselves as those things instead of saying like, I was talking with one of my clients that was dealing with depression and suicide. And I was like, well, there is depression in your experience. You are not depressed. There's depression in your experience. There's suicidal thoughts in your experience. How are you relating to that? Are you identifying as that or not? And of course, this takes work, this takes awareness, but this takes action and responsibility and being able to understand it and to be able to move past that. Because in my years of experience working in this space, there's a lot, and this is something that you touched on before, everything that has been quote unquote negative is more in our awareness, because everything that comes from that is more intense energy. So everything that is going to be more intensified, it's going to be there for us. I'm not going to be thinking all of the time on all of these nice little things that happen when this one thing that was really hard and negative happened. That is going to be more in my awareness. The same as with a lot of people, and I see this in social media, really nice comments, and then one person like negative, and suddenly bam, all of the energy goes into that, and it's like, well, that is how we are wired. The light things, they're just light, and the heavier things, it's heavier. We're going to gravitate towards the heavier. And how do we deal with that? That is really, really important. And I know, Richie, like we could be talking about all of this for hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. What are some things that people can do based on your experience and based on what you see? Like, what are some I wouldn't say easy. What are some things that you think that people can start to incorporate if they haven't yet in their toolkit for dealing with things?
If we're talking about things as in like keeping mentally well and like dealing with like mood-based disorders like anxiety or depression or grief or stress. Yo, man, it sounds simple, but apparently it's like really complicated. It's lifestyle factors. And there'll be super woke people on Twitter who critique this response. And they're like, you can't just like will your way out of depression. Well, fucking science says that you can do shit that gets you out of it. So things like meditation. If you practice meditation, really good for your mental wellness, your mental fitness. If you put in regular exercise every single day, really good for your mental health. If you eat healthy and natural foods regularly, excellent for your moods, because your moods affect your mental well-being. Like your food affects your mood. It's like not rocket science, but most people don't eat, or they eat too much, or they eat too much of the wrong things. And then as you get like fat and obese, again, that's not like body shaming. Like obesity is a contributing factor to poor mental health, and not to mention all other number of like life-ending illnesses. If you do your best to give back to society in some small way, it's really, really good for you. Like being kind and donating time or energy or a skill that you might have to some sort of not-for-profit, some sort of charity, or even just people in your community or your family. That's really good for you. Human beings are social animals. We're tribal creatures. If we get excommunicated from the tribe, we feel terrible. We're meant to be like intimately connected with one another to flourish. But increasingly, we have like 1,000 followers on Instagram and like maybe one person that we can actually give a phone call to. Other simple things we can do is like not be online so much. And that's my bad habit. And that is what I do to sabotage my own mental health, is I spend too much time on social media. But if we can divorce our sense of importance from how many likes, follows, retweets, shares, and like doom scrolling and soaking up all the bad fucking news all the time and the latest conspiracy theory, that's actually going to be really good for us. Get enough sunshine, go outside with your shirt off in your backyard, like get fresh air, get into the ocean. Like cold therapy is really good. Get into the cold water, right? All these sorts of things are actually not out of the grasp of anyone, irrespective of like their skin color, their sexuality, their financial status. Yes, there are financial and structural causatives that make some of these things more difficult for some groups of people other than others. And the alcohol companies and junk food companies target like populations of color and marginalized communities, and that's really bullshit. And that's why we do need like political and structural changes to happen in that space. But all people can go for a walk and drink water and go to bed earlier and work to help one another do these sorts of things and come together as communities. More deeply, it is about having conversations like this with your family. Why is dad the way he is? Like what happened to my grandfather, or like what's great granddad who went away and we don't know his name, what's his story? And when we can like understand what happened before us, it's easy to know where we're going, right? Like it's like a roadmap, understanding our past. When we think about like who we are now, there is a whole history of people behind us who in some way affect how we show up in the world, right? Understanding that helps us make better sense of ourselves. And it's like you talked about, we can start making decisions rather than just reactions. And that's what I really love about your practices, Brian, is that, I tend to go head first, right? And I'm trying to change that. I do everything through like force of will and intellect and like psychological understandings and literature and academia, and that's kind of worked for me to some point. But there's so much that I think we would get if we could do what you're doing: meditation, Buddhist practices, tens of thousands of years of spiritual practice and teachings have got so much for us, but we kind of like sideline them as a bit woo-woo and out there. And that's why I'm grateful to Claire, my partner, like for reintroducing me to them, because I did used to have some interest in like Buddhism, and I read the Dalai Lama's books and have this cursory knowledge. I was like, oh, that makes sense. Well, right? But then you drift away from them. Those sorts of things are beautiful, right? Yeah. So all those sorts of things take effort and they take consistent practice. And actually, we tend to only look for those sort of solutions when we're sick. But it's like, how do we do them all the time and normalize them so that we don't get sick? And that's where the rub lies. And that's, more macroly, that's where I get annoyed, right? Big capitalist enterprises don't make any fucking money off us being well or being happy, right? They want us like at the bottle shop, shopping all the time for cars that we can't afford, glued to our iPhones, arguing over superficial changes. And I'm not entirely sure what the answer is there, but I do know that if we can be physically, mentally, societally, emotionally healthy, keep our community, our whānau healthy, then that's a start, man.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful because yes, there is no one answer. We're all different. We all will need different ways of understanding and different strategies. And there's so much that we've been conditioned. And as you say, this is one of the interesting things always for me. Most of these tools, they are free. Most of the lifestyles, like things that you're saying, they are free. But the problem is that if we are caught up in these loops of trauma and these loops of survival mode, then of course we're not going to be able to even understand that's a possibility. And then we're being caught up in that race and that cycle that is unhelpful. And we need to somehow find a way to cut that circle and to be able to do that. And a lot of times that takes, like listening to someone or you showing up at a school and talking and actually planting a seed to a kid. And it's like, oh, actually, all of these ideas that I had of how I need to fit in, actually, they might not be helpful. And then they can start to do things. But as you say, like, this is a lot of work that needs to happen on a lot of different perspectives. And I think that from my experience is when we start to look in and when we start to look out, the symptoms are showing us the disconnection, and we need to reconnect and to be able to understand that we're all different. How do we reconnect? What is the way to do that so that it's helpful and doesn't take our entire life to get to that place?
Yeah. And that's why what you're doing is helpful, right? As I wanted to say this earlier, is that we've had different lived experiences, but neither of them are more valid, right? Like, you have a different approach to healing and helping people grow than I do, but we're both heading towards the same direction. And that's it. Like, there are so many different routes to helping people be healthy and happy and develop self-knowledge. And one way isn't better than the other.
No.
And it's about, people hit me up for information or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I don't really know. Or this guy would be better at that than I would. Or take this with a grain of salt. This is how I do it. But that's not for everyone, right? So
yeah,
I think it's just about, we're all different parts of the jigsaw puzzle. And we just need to keep playing the game.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Richie, for this conversation. It has been wonderful. There's so much more that I would love to unpack. For anyone that wants to go online or find whenever Richie is doing more talks, I love especially like some of your talks on alcohol and pornography and all of that side of our behaviors, especially that are not that helpful for our development. And I know that if we would talk about that, this would go like for 5 more hours, which I would love to, but like we all need to do stuff. So yes, like check it out. I will put some links on the comments with the show notes so that you can find it easily. Thanks, Richie, once more, and thanks everyone for listening.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Brian. It was a pleasure.
What did you like the most about this episode? Take a moment to think about what change you can make in your life today.
Share your conscious action on social media using #ConsciousAction and tagging @ConsciousActionNZ so we can celebrate your impact on the world and create a ripple effect.
One easy action we would love for you to take right now is to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast. This will help us get these messages out into the world and inspire more people to take conscious action in their own lives, contributing to the better world we hope for.